there is no application of the policy. The Class 3 streams is the example in the current policy. The limitations are minimal in comparison to that of fish locations, streams that have fisheries in them, or streams that contribute to a location that significantly would diminish the water available for fish. So there is some consideration for small ponds and small diversions, very small, but legally there is no limitation. It's diversion and use of water is what it says.
The second question had to do with the speakers reiterated that the policy is set to establish to protect fish, and then it led into the question, was it developed to allow the maximum possible diversion? And I tried to address this in our earlier remarks at the beginning of this item. We looked at a number of alternatives for all the different criteria that are proposed in the policy, and we identified which alternative criteria were protective and which were not. When we had multiple criteria that were determined to be protective, we selected the one that allowed the most diversion. So the answer is yes and no. We didn't select the alternatives that allowed the most diversion or the maximum possible diversion if that meant not being protective of in-stream flows. If it meant being protective, then we did. When we had those options, we chose them. The third question was with respect to there's a criteria in the policy that's called the maximum cumulative diversion, and it's set at 5% of the 1.5-year return flow. And the questioner stated that in the technical analysis, it says that that amount of diversion rate is not going to have an impact on fish. He went on to ask what would happen if you raised it to 10 or 20% or higher. The first point I'll make here is this is one of the things that our two resource consultants, the fisheries and engineering consultants, evaluated was how much water, how much of the peak flows can you take out without having an adverse effect on what they call macro habitat or overall channel structure. So peak flows are what sort of form the basic structure of a channel over time, and it's pretty widely recognized that if you take those out, you're going to have changes to the channel, and that can be adverse to fish. And in their analysis, they compiled some existing research and studies, and they concluded it's a very difficult question to answer. There's a lot of uncertainty in figuring out how much of these peak flows can you take away. So they relied on some theoretical equations that were developed, and they also relied on the 2002 NIMS DFG guidelines, which specified that a 5% reduction in the 1.5-year return flow would not adversely affect channel structure over the long term. So based on the NIMS 2002 guidelines, their professional opinion, and in the uncertainty, they decided that that was a reasonable number, and they concluded that if we stuck to that number, if we limited the diversion rate to 5% of the 1.5-year return flow, you would not have a significant adverse effect on fish. They actually used some equations to determine that a 5% change would result in a 2% change to the channel geomorphology. And the relationship was pretty linear. The questioner asked, what would happen if it was 10%? Well, if it was 10%, you'd get approximately a 4% change. They didn't say 10% was not protective or 20% was not protective. They said 5% was. They said it was conservative. They said that number could likely or could possibly be increased if additional research or site-specific studies were done. But they concluded the 5% was protective. Again, they didn't say a greater number was not protective. They just relied on mostly their professional judgment and the judgment of DFG and NIMS in their 2002 guidelines.
Okay. Rudy Light, followed by...
There was one more question, actually.
Okay. All right.
And this question had to do with how will the success of the program be measured? And Within the policy itself, there's a provision for effectiveness monitoring, and it's a program that the State Water Board could implement to install monitoring locations, collect data to assess how effective the criteria are in protecting anadromous salmonids, protecting stream flows for anadromous salmonids. The program, we currently do not have funding for that type of program, but once we do get funding for that type of program, then we could start looking at implementing it. It suggests that we could look at recommendations that are contained in the scientific report prepared by our consultants, and that is something that we could consider at the point in time when we do receive funding for the program.
Mr. Light, followed by Janet Polly.
Excuse me. Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Rudy Light, and I have several questions for staff. Eric, it's nice to see you again. The first one is this, that the policy, I believe it's in section 7, mentions that existing license terms may be modified in the future. I suspect that means that the Water Board will do the modification requirement rather than the individual. Is there any chance that in the future that licensed on-stream ponds will be required to either be torn down and replaced by pit ponds, and that if so, that there will be minimum bypass flow structures required in order to pump into the pit pond? The second question relates to this also. Will licensed on-stream ponds possibly be required to install a passive bypass system, or, as one of the alternatives, a real-time monitoring of inflow and outflow to conform with minimum bypass flow and maximum cumulative diversion? Those are my two questions. And the second, or really third thing I have is really a comment that I would like the board and the audience to understand about the minimum bypass flow rate. It's related to the drainage area, and as the drainage area is reduced, the minimum bypass flow rate requirements increases. In other words, that the minimum bypass flow requirement on small watersheds becomes very restrictive. I have a handout here, and I apologize for not having enough of them. I would ask you to turn to the second, to look at the bottom paragraphs. In watersheds, I'm making some assumptions here that a flow rate is 2.12 cubic feet per second over the entire year, and I've gone through the formula that the Water Board has provided, and I'm assuming that that 20 feet per second is constant over various watersheds. We know in reality it isn't so. But what it shows is that in watersheds of 1 square mile, there's only a few days each year when the actual flow will be greater than the minimum bypass flow. In this rate, this case 20 cubic feet per second. In very small watersheds, say 160 acres, there will never be any diversions allowed simply because you can't meet the minimum bypass flow requirement. It might say that you have 5 days to divert the water, but in that case the water is probably going to be going over at flood stage because these flows happen very rarely. Can you please comment?
I'll respond to a couple things while we have one of our engineering staffs looking at what's presented, and we may not be able to comment on it in the time given here. The question about licensed water rights, will in the future, will the board require that they be torn down or modified? The board does retain jurisdiction over and the ability to